And I did post on BSpace this letter that I wrote to Kim about his criticisms of my views. So I won't make that a signed reading, but if you want to write a paper if you want to write your next paper on the debate between me and Kim, you should certainly read that letter. He never responded to it, so I don't know what he thinks about it. Maybe he didn't have a response. All right, well, where are we? The overall question we're dealing with essentially is the relation between human beings and the universe. And since the essential term of that relation is the mind, the essential feature that human beings have that enables them to relate to the universe is their sets of mental capacities. The course in the philosophy of mind is essentially about the mental capacities that relate us to the rest of the universe. Now, there are different ways to teach such a course, and I think the way that I do it is probably different from the way that it's taught anywhere else. I don't have much sympathy for mainstream philosophy of mind. I think it is one dreadful mistake after another. In a way, strong artificial intelligence is one of the most honorable aspects of mainstream philosophy of mind, because at least there's some intellectual content to the idea that inside our heads there's really a digital computer, and being conscious is just running the right computer program. And that's at least worth arguing about in a way that I don't think the behaviorism or the extended mind are worth arguing about. Now, there's one view that I think is false, but it's not preposterous, and that's property dualism. And since I am frequently accused of property dualism, so much to the point that I, in exasperation, wrote an article called "Why I Am Not a Property Dualist." You know, you felt like you were back in the 1950s writing "Why I Am Not a Communist." But in any case, I should put that on BSpace as well, in case you want to read it. I'll put that, "Why I Am Not a Property Dualist." And the editor said, but it's ambiguous. It can mean the reasons you have for not embracing property dualism, or why it's wrong to accuse me of property dualism. And I said, that's right, it is ambiguous, and I want precisely that ambiguity, because I mean it in both senses. I think I have good reasons for not being one, and people who accuse me of it haven't understood it. But still, it's not ridiculously false to say consciousness is indeed a non-physical property of the brain, and it is, to put it in my jargon, a higher level feature of the brain, and it has these characteristics that I keep mentioning: subjectivity, qualitativeness, and unity. And that, so far, that sounds like something like my view. What's wrong with that? Well, the thing that's really wrong with it is when you use the traditional categories and you say non-physical, because if it's non-physical, then it can't have any physical effects. Epiphenomenalism will follow immediately. So what you have to do is to try to state the truth without using the traditional vocabulary. And that's very hard to do because most of us are brought up on that vocabulary. So I want to say consciousness, for all of its touchy-feely, subjective, what it feels like, qualitative, mysterious features, that's a physical property. It's a physical property of the brain. I'll take questions in a second. And that's not property dualism. I mean, in one sentence, what's wrong with property dualism? I don't want to write your paper for you if you want to write about this, but in one sentence, what's wrong with it is there's no way that a sincere property dualist can avoid epiphenomenalism. And I think the more courageous, or if you like, the more outrageous property dualists like Dave Chalmers just embrace epiphenomenalism. But you can't take epiphenomenalism seriously. You're going to say nobody in the history of the universe ever ate because she was hungry, or drank because she was thirsty, or cried because she was sad. That's not it's not a reasonable view. But in any case, of the views that I'm rejecting, property dualism has the most appeal. It just has at least one absolutely absurd consequence. Now that consequence is part of a larger absurd consequence, namely the universe divides into two. It divides into the physical and the mental, and that's a division that I'm rejecting. So when I say that consciousness is a physical property, I mean something totally different from what these other guys mean. When Dan Dennett says that, what he means is consciousness doesn't exist. They're just computational states of the brain. What I mean is, yes, it does exist for all its qualitativeness, subjectivity, etc. And what I do in the book that you're assigned is I make a list of the traditional conception of the mental on one side of the page and the traditional conception of the physical on the other side of the page, and then I just take the subjective, qualitative, touchy-feely features of consciousness and move them over to the right side of the page, move them over to the physical properties. Then you leave behind the false claims that consciousness doesn't have a physical location in the brain. It obviously does. That it doesn't have physical dimensions, that it doesn't have electrical, chemical features. Of course it does. It couldn't work causally if it didn't. So anyway, that's this is sort of a parting thought about mainstream philosophy of mind. Mainstream philosophy of mind is largely a series of embarrassing mistakes. And I don't know what it feels like to be one of these guys who denies the existence of consciousness. I mean, I want to go up and pinch them. But in any case, they at least say they deny the existence of consciousness. Okay, now we get to what I think is the most interesting part of the course, and that's where I talk about how it actually works, how the mind works to relate us to the environment. And the key notion there is the notion of intentionality. So that's going to be the main topic of today's lecture. This is an introduction to the theory of intentionality, and you should read the first 3 chapters of the book, Intentionality. All right, questions about, there'll be more, I'll make more rude remarks about mainstream philosophy of mind before the semester's over. But if there are any parting questions, or yes, you had a question about property dualism. Yeah.
I understand what you mean when you say nobody ever ate because they were hungry.
Yeah.
But I still don't see why epiphenomenalism is such a pariah. I mean, isn't it just another way of describing a higher level feature of the brain?
Yeah, you see, but nobody says that about other higher level features. Nobody says, well, the solidity of the hammer doesn't make any difference to driving the nail. Oh, yes, it does. Try and drive a nail with a hammer made out of butter or made out of water. It isn't going to work. So the higher level features matter. And there's a wonderful example given by the famous neuroscientist, neurobiologist Roger Sperry. And I feel bad because I never met the guy or even corresponded with him he died before I got to him, so to speak. And it turns out he had many of my views long before I did. I didn't know that. But in any case, he had a brilliant example that I want to give to you. He said, the way that the brain works by top-down causation, the way the consciousness works, is typical of nature. If you take a wheel rolling down a hill, it can be attached to your car, it's rolling down a hill. Now take a single molecule inside the wheel. The trajectory of that molecule is fixed by the whole structure of the wheel. By the solidity and the shape of the wheel will determine the structure of the molecule that's inside the wheel. This is a case where the higher level feature, the solidity of the wheel, has causal consequences down to the lower level because that determines the trajectory of particular molecules. Do you get the example? Do you see the way the example works? Yeah, of course. The molecules determine the solidity and the shape of the wheel. But the solidity and the shape of the wheel then determine the trajectory of any particular molecule. So, of course, the bottom level always cashes out, the top level always cashes out in the bottom level. That's true of nature generally. But it doesn't, to show that, if you really take that seriously, you'd have to say, well, actually, the only thing that operates causally are subatomic particles. And that's, you can see why in a certain philosophical mood you'd want to say that, but that's wrong. As we ordinarily use the notion of causation, and we're going to talk about intentional causation, causation is what makes it happen. And if you want to know what makes it happen, you have to look at higher levels than that of quarks and muons, at higher levels than that of the microparticles. So the solidity of the table functions causally, even though, of course, the solidity itself is caused by and realized in the behavior of the molecules. So there is no metaphysical problem about higher level features functioning causally. It's just that their causal capacities have to be explained by by the behavior of the lower level elements. To put it in very simple terms, micro phenomena causally explain macro phenomena, but macro phenomena do not thereby either cease to exist nor fail to have any causal consequences. Again, to repeat, you can't drive a nail with a hammer unless it's solid. If it's made out of butter, it won't work to drive nails. But of course, the solidity itself, though it's a causal feature, is causally explained by the behavior of the lower level elements. Okay, are you happy with that? You can come back because it's an important issue. Any other questions? Because this is your last chance to get in a crack at mainstream philosophy of mind, though we will come back to it. I mean, it continues. It'll continue to haunt us. But now we're going to talk about intentionality. Okay, here goes. For those of you who keep notes, new heading, intentionality. In fact, if it's me, I even capitalize it. All right, first of all, as I think I've said before, it's a kind of dreadful word because it suggests that intentionality has some special connection with intending, in the sense in which I intend to go to the movies or intend to do my homework on time. But of course, intending in that sense is just one kind of intentionality among others, along with belief and hope and fear and desire and love and hate and depression and ecstasy. All of those are intentional states, and the definition of intentionality is aboutness or directedness. It is the aboutness or the directedness of the mind. Well, why then do we use this confusing word? Why do we use a word that sounds like it's intending to go to the movies? And the answer is, like a lot of confusing words, we got it from the Germans. It was we got it from German speakers. It was brought into philosophy by an Austrian philosopher named Franz Brentano in the 19th century. And Brentano I picked it up from the Latin, from the medieval philosophers. They used the word intentio, and he brought it into German as intentionalität with an umlaut. And of course, it's not confusing in German, because the German for intending, in the sense in which I intend to go to the movies, is Absicht. And I'm sorry, you can't speak German without sounding like a Gestapo officer. But anyway, that's half the fun of speaking German. Absicht does not sound at all like Intentionalität. So Germans don't have this confusion. So just keep in mind, it takes about 30 seconds to explain that intentionality, in the technical sense, doesn't mean intending in the ordinary sense. Intending is one kind of intentionality, along with belief and hope and fear and desire. Okay, now this is, I think, the central notion in the philosophy of mind, and it's we're going to have to say in some detail how it's related to consciousness. On the face of it, it looks like we now have two mind-body problems. One is the problem of consciousness. How is it possible that this hunk of stuff in my skull can be conscious? How can this 3 pounds of, it's about 1.5 kilograms, about 3 pounds of neuronal structures in my skull, how can that have any feelings? How can it be conscious? But there's a related question about intentionality. How can it be about anything? If I now think about what's happening in Libya today, then it seems mysterious. How can a piece of, as one guy put it to me in a letter, how can a piece of meat be about anything? That's the mind-body problem as applied to intentionality. Okay, now with both of these, both the problem of consciousness and the problem of intentionality, there are two ways of approaching the problem. One is the sort of the big deal way. How is it possible that such a thing can exist at all. That's the mind-body problem for consciousness, and the mind-body problem for intentionality would be the same, would be phrased in the same way. How is intentionality possible? But there's another problem that I think in a way is more interesting, and which provides in the long run the right way to solve the first problem, and that is, how does it work in detail? If you put the mind-body problem as, how can a piece of meat in your skull be conscious? That seems pretty tough. But if you ask, how can an animal become consciously thirsty? Well, we know a lot about how that works. We know how various processes in the brain produce feelings of thirst. And this, I think, is the right way to approach intentionality. Now, out of respect for the philosophical tradition, with consciousness, I started with Descartes and led you through the standard mistakes, led you through the standard views. But I'm not going to do that with intentionality. I'm going to tell you in detail what the structure of intentionality is. And then we'll see that there is a relation between intentionality and consciousness that's much closer than most mainstream philosophers or cognitive scientists admit. Basically, the idea that I'm going to advance, I'm not ready to say it yet, but the idea I'm going to put forward is that we do have unconscious intentional states, but we understand an unconscious intentional state only on the model of a conscious intentional state, and indeed we make sense of the notion of an unconscious intentional state as the notion of a state which, though then and there it's unconscious, is the kind of thing that could become conscious. You may be unable to bring it to consciousness for various reasons, such as forgetfulness or brain damage or repression. You got some psychological block. But the idea of an unconscious intentional state is the idea of one that's potentially conscious. Now, in the past few decades of cognitive science, the temptation has always been to think, well, the right way to go about this is forget about consciousness. It's too mysterious. Let's just talk about intentionality. And indeed, the cognitive scientist's name for intentionality makes it sound more scientific. They call it information processing. And in the early days of cognitive science, the conventional conception was it's an information processing science, and what we're going to discover, what we're going to examine, is how the brain processes information. And to do that, you don't have to know anything about consciousness. You just do the information processing, and I don't have to tell you the next step, but I will. The next step is to say, and what's the nature of that information processing? Aha! We've invented wonderful machines that do information processing. They're called computers. So the brain is a digital computer, and mental states are computational states implemented in a computer program in the brain. Okay, now that's, as you know, not the view that I adopt, so I'm going to start with the idea that no, we really do have intentional states. They really are states in our brain which have, so to speak, intrinsically mental content. They are intrinsically about something. If I believe that George Washington was the first president of the United States, or I desire to go skiing this weekend, the belief and the desire actually exist in my brain. And what exactly are they, and what's their structure? Well, the first distinction that I need to make is between what I will call intrinsic, or some people like to call it original intentionality, from derived intentionality. And derived intentionality is always observer relative, whereas intrinsic intentionality is observer independent. Let me give you some examples. If I now say, I believe that it is snowing in the Sierra, which I do, I checked it out a while ago, I hope it's going to stop because I want to go skiing. But if I believe that it's snowing in the Sierra, then that belief is an intrinsic intentional state. But if I take the English sentence, it is snowing in the Sierra, that sentence means that it's snowing in the Sierra. That sentence has intentionality. But the intentionality of the sentence is derived from the intentionality of English speakers. The intentionality of the sentence is an observer relative intentionality, where the intentionality of the original belief is original or intrinsic. If I believe that it's raining, my belief is an intrinsic state of my brain. If I tell somebody in French, il pleut, then the sentence, the French sentence that means it's raining, only has that meaning relative to French speakers, relative to the users of the French language. So the sentence has an intentionality that is observer relative, whereas the actual belief itself has an intentionality that's intrinsic. Now, a third usage I have to caution you against, and that is the metaphorical usage of intentional vocabulary, and of course that's very common. In fact, some of these metaphors have now become dead metaphors. They've now acquired a new literal meaning. So if I say, my current computer has a bigger memory than my earlier computer. Well, memory is an intentionalistic notion. But of course, there's no literal mental life in my computer. That's a metaphorical or as if usage. You can see this distinction between these three, between the intrinsic, the derived, and the metaphorical, if you consider actual a difference, the same kind of sentence used for all three. Suppose I say, I am thirsty. The actual feeling of thirst is intrinsic intentionality. It's directed at drinking. It means that the thirst will be satisfied only if I drink something. The English sentence, I am thirsty, like the French sentence, j'ai soif, also has intentionality, but it is derived. It's not intrinsic. It's a matter of convention that we use the sentence that way. And then in addition, there are metaphorical uses. If I say, my car is thirsty for gasoline, that is a metaphorical or as if usage. Now, I hope this all seems screamingly obvious to you, and you wonder, why is this guy boring with his obvious distinctions? The answer is an awful lot of philosophical confusion rests on a failure to see these distinctions. People think that the metaphorical use is literal, that the computer literally has mental states, and they don't see the distinction between the derived intentionality, where we attribute intentionality to sentences, pictures, maps, and the intrinsic intentionality. If I say I know the way to San Jose, that describes an intrinsic intentionality in me. If I say this map knows the way to San Jose, because you can figure out how to get to San Jose by looking at the map, that is a derived intentionality. The map doesn't literally know anything. Okay, let's take questions about that. Yes. I have to come around closer to you because the acoustics are bad, and B, my hearing's not as good as it used to be.
It seems like language is a weird place to kind of just draw. I guess I see where you're saying that, like, it's language outside your head, but it seems like any complex thought I have is in language.
No,
it's inside my head in language, though.
That's a very deep philosophical point, and I'm glad you raised it because I wasn't sure if I should make the next point I'm going to make, so let me make it. It's a bit tricky to make this distinction because typically the way that the intrinsic intentionality of the human mind manifests itself is by using the derived intentionality of English sentences. So, here I am, I'm thirsty. Thirst is an intrinsic intentional state. Now then, let's take the English sentence, I am thirsty. That also has intentionality, but it is derived. But now if I perform the speech act, I tell you, I am thirsty, then the intentionality of that very speech act is intrinsic. because that is an intentional performance on my part, and it couldn't be that very speech act if it didn't have that very meaning, whereas the sentence could be that very sentence and mean something else. So you use the derived intentionality of English sentences in order to express the original intentionality, the original or intrinsic intentionality of the speech act or the thought that you have. Now, this gets more complicated when you reflect on the fact that a very large number of the thoughts and feelings you have, you couldn't have if you didn't know language. La Rochefoucauld, the great French philosopher, has one. You should read La Rochefoucauld if you don't read anybody else. He has wonderful sentences, and one of my favorites is this. He says, very few people would ever fall in love if they never read about it. And nowadays we'd have to add, they have to see it in the movies and on television. What you learn when you acquire a culture is, among other things, how to fall in love. There's a scenario, there's an expected pattern of behavior that goes with falling in love. I don't have to tell you that how important it is in popular culture. I don't know if the movies make such a thing out of it as they used to a long time ago. I don't go to movies much. But in any case, it is an important item in popular culture. Okay. Now, what are we saying there? That to put it in the sense that I'm trying to get across now, you couldn't really have the experience of falling in love if you didn't have the concept. And to have the concept, you have to have the derived intentionality of the language. And this is true of a lot of things. My dog Gilbert has all kinds of wonderful traits. But Gilbert does not suffer the angst of post-industrial man under late capitalism. He doesn't even suffer the angst of post-industrial doggies under late capitalism because he doesn't think about that kind of stuff. He doesn't have the linguistic capacity. So, I mean, it's a deep question you ask, and I'm going to give you a very short summary answer. The question is, if the intentionality of sentences is derived, then what kind of intentionality is there when I use a sentence to express my actual thoughts and feelings? And the answer is the thoughts and feelings expressed in sentences have intrinsic intentionality, even though the sentences used to express them have only derived intentionality. What's the proof? The proof is it couldn't be that very thought if it didn't have that content, if it didn't have that intentionality. But it could be that very sentence if it meant something different. The fact that the sentence means what it does is a matter of convention. Okay, any other questions? Because now I'm going to go into the structure. Now we're going to talk about the structure of intentional states. Yes? Yes, yeah. A symbolism, pictures are derived intentionality. I don't know if we don't have any pictures here, but if this were a totalitarian state, there would be a picture of our great leader, and it would represent our great leader. And that's the pictures, photographs, all have derived intentionality. Maps, diagrams, any form of symbolism. Anything that can stand for anything else or represent anything else has intentionality. And if the intentionality isn't intrinsic, then it will be derived. It's derived from the usage we make of it. Yes?
It seems like you're varying the analogy between intrinsic and derived to syntax and semantics. I was wondering if that...
Yes. Okay. It's another deep question. It looks like the distinction between the derived and the intrinsic is the same as the distinction between syntax and semantics. It's not the same, but it's closely related. The syntax has the semantics attached to it in a way that gives it an observer relative or derived intentionality. The semantic content has to represent, it has to enable the syntactical object to represent, because the semantic content has intrinsic intentionality. And we're going to hear more about that when we talk about language. Okay, let me start giving you some apparatus with which you can think more clearly about this. One way to explain intentionality is to show the connection between intentionality and language, to show the similarities. Now that would be misleading if I gave you the impression that all intentionality was linguistic, It isn't. It's the other way around. All language is intentionalistic. But you will see the features of intentionality much more clearly if you see how they relate to the features of language. Now, in the study of language, if this were a course in the philosophy of language, I would say you have to have a basic distinction between the content of the speech act and the type of speech act that it is. We all hear the difference between "you will leave the room," "will you leave the room," and "leave the room." All of those have the same content, that you will leave the room, but they have it in a different type of speech act. One is an assertion, "you will leave the room." Another is a question, "will you leave the room?" And the third is an order, "leave the room." So it's the same propositional content, that you will leave the room, but it's presented with a different force, a different way, a different type of speech act. Now that distinction between content and force carries over exactly to the mind. Just as I can order you to leave the room, predict that you will leave the room, or ask whether you will leave the room, so I can believe you will leave the room, wish you would leave the room, hope that you will leave the room, wonder whether you will leave the room. And so the FP picture for the structure of the speech act works exactly for the structure of the mental state. You need the S to represent the different types of states: beliefs, hope, fears, and desires. And you need the P to represent the content of the different types of intentional states. The intentional states that are most interesting to us are those that have a whole propositional content, that you will leave the room. But there are lots of intentional states that don't at least seem to have a propositional content. They're just directed at objects. You're in love with Sally. You hate Billy. You admire Jimmy Carter, let's say. Now, all of those will look like this. You just have a state, and then there is a referring expression inside the state. That is, the state is directed at a particular object. And we'll have to discuss the relation between these and these. I think these that have a whole propositional content are primary, and the others really are disguised forms. But that's controversial. And similarly, you get speech acts that don't have a whole propositional content. Hurrah for the 49ers, down with the Raiders. Those will have speech acts that express approval and disapproval just directed at an object. They're of this form. They're not such a big deal in language, but there are lots of important intentional states that are just directed at particular objects. There's a very misleading name for these in the literature, and you'll see it over and over. These are called propositional attitudes. And I don't like that term. I just say it's an intentional state with a propositional content. Why not? The terminology of propositional attitudes suggests that these intentional states are attitudes that people have to propositions. And a lot of philosophers say that explicitly. If you believe that Barack Obama is president, then you have an attitude of belief to the proposition that Barack Obama is president. I think that's exactly the wrong thing to say. If you have a belief that Barack Obama is president, then your attitude is directed to the actual guy, Barack Obama, and not to the proposition. The proposition is what enables you to have the attitude directed to the guy. But the terminology of propositional attitudes, it's now become standard. I've been fighting against it, but I think I'm gonna lose this battle. It's gonna become even more common to refer to these as propositional attitudes, but it's very misleading. However, the important point is most intentional states that interest us, love and hate, belief and, I leave out love and hate, belief and desire, hope and fear have entire propositional contents. Now, love and hate apparently can be directed just at single objects. I'll get back to those later. But I want you to see the typical intentional state has an entire propositional content, and the propositional content occurs in a certain psychological mode, such as belief or desire. Okay, questions about that? You had a question. Yeah.
This might be getting into like epistemic considerations, but what if like there's a state in which either there is no object or proposition, or you don't know, like I'm depressed, I don't know why I'm
Yeah,
depressed.
okay. Now, this, again, a very good question. The question for people at the back of the room was, well, what about cases where you don't know what the propositional content is, where you're just depressed, but you don't know what you're depressed about? The answer is you need to make a distinction between those mental states that actually are intentional, that actually are directed at objects and states of affairs, and those that are not directed. There are forms of anxiety where you're just nervous, you're just jumpy, you're not anxious or nervous about anything. If somebody asks you, what are you so nervous about? The answer is, I don't know, or not about anything, I'm just jumpy today. And those will be states where you have the psychological state, but there is no content. Now, there's an interesting hypothesis that a lot of the psychoanalysts believe, and that is all of those are really unconscious intentional states. That when you're in a state of great anxiety, but you don't know what you're anxious about, then that's because you have repressed the actual content. I don't know if that's right, but I do know that at least on the face of it, you need to distinguish between mental states that have intentionality and those that don't have intentionality. There are lots of conscious intentional states that lack any intentional content. Mood is a great form of conscious mental life that does not necessarily have an intentional content, because you can be cheerful. You can be a cheerful mood or a depressed mood. You can be elated or down in the dumps without actually having any content. And I think I told you once when I tried to explain these ideas to an audience of psychoanalysts, they said that's our job, is to take undirected anxiety and teach the patient what he or she, or let the patient make it clear what he or she is really anxious about. The unconscious content will come to a form of consciousness. Okay, we're going to be talking about the cases that have a content, because it's that content that enables you to relate to reality. Yes, you had a question.
But it seems that if someone's expressing an unconscious state, or is conscious of it but it doesn't have intention, it seems to me that speech acts are necessarily intentional.
It's a bit trickier than I have said. But let me see if I can answer that question. You tell me if I've answered it. There is one huge difference between these over here and these here. And that is, this is an intentional action in the ordinary sense of intentional. You cannot have a speech act unless you intended to perform the speech act. You didn't make the promise unless you intended to make a promise. If you were just scratching your head and she thought it was a promise of marriage, well, there has been a miscommunication. Okay, there has been a misunderstanding. But in my culture, when you are scratching your, well, you fill in the details. But an honest-to-John speech act is an intentional action. Now, I'm going to get to that in a few minutes. So I'm just going through the steps. So far, we have found one crucial similarity between the structure of the language and the structure of mind. They both have a content presented in a certain mode. Now, the second similarity, so I'm going to just list these. One, FP, SP. The second similarity, and this is crucial, the brain enables us to relate our mental representations to reality in at least two fundamentally different ways. It gets more complicated, but at least at the beginning, there are two fundamentally different ways. You can have statements whose purpose is to tell you how things are, and you can have orders whose purpose is not to tell you how things are, but to get the world to change so the world matches the content of the order. Statements have what I will call the word-to-world direction of fit. There, if I say, I predict that you will leave the room, then the prediction will be true if you leave the room, and the propositional content will fit reality, if it's true, with what I call the word-to-world direction of fit. But not all speech acts are like that. If I order you to leave the room, then my order will not be true or false, but will be obeyed or disobeyed depending on how your behavior comes to match the content of the order. And for those cases, I want to say they have the world to word direction of fit, because the aim is not to represent how things are in the world, where the propositional content represents the facts in the world, but rather is to get the world to change to match the propositional content. The direction of fit goes from world to word rather than word to world. The simplest test for whether or not something has this direction of fit is, can you literally say that it's true or false? So the statement can be true or false. The order cannot be true or false. The promise cannot be true or false. The order can be obeyed or disobeyed. The promise can be kept or broken. Now, this is absolutely fundamental, and it is a reflection or manifestation of the fact that in our nervous system, there's a distinction between the sensory nervous system, which gives you information about how the world is, and the motor nervous system that enables you to change the world so the world comes to match the way you want it to be. You have these two absolutely fundamental directions of fit. And the actual terminology that I'm using of direction of fit was invented by an English philosopher, J.L. Austin. But the best illustration of it was given by Elizabeth Anscombe. There's a certain irony here, because Anscombe and Austin did not get on very well. I knew both of them very well, and Austin always referred to Elizabeth as that ninny. And I don't know what Elizabeth thought about Austin, but it was not very sympathetic. Anyway, the best explanation of this distinction is given by Anscombe with the following example. She says, suppose a wife gives her husband a shopping list and sends him off to the supermarket to buy things in the supermarket. And the shopping list says beer, butter, and bacon. Now, the husband takes this list and goes around and puts things in his shopping cart to match the items on the list. He tries to make the shopping cart match the list. But suppose he's followed by a detective who writes down, well, it needn't be a sinister plot. It's an FBI agent off duty and he's keeping in practice. Okay, he just wants to keep in practice. So the detective writes down beer, butter, and bacon. By the time they get to the checkout counter, they have exactly the same list. The detective's list contains these three items, and the husband's list contains these three items. But the function of the list is totally different. The function of the husband's list is to get reality to change to match the list. The function of the detective list is to get the list to match reality. And you see this quite dramatically if you imagine a mistake. The detective gets home and he thinks, that guy didn't actually buy bacon. He bought pork chops. So I'll just erase bacon and write in pork chops. The husband gets home and the wife says, "You idiot, I put bacon on the list and you bought pork chops." And he says, "That's okay, honey, we can fix that. We'll just erase bacon and write in pork chops." Okay. Now, why does it work for the detective, but it doesn't work for the husband? And the answer is because the detective's list has a different function altogether. The detective list is to match an independently existing reality, whereas the husband's list has this direction of fit. It has the direction of fit of orders and commands, whereas the detective's list has the direction of fit of statements and descriptions. I want everybody to see that because it's going to be crucial in understanding how the mind relates to reality. Now, this distinction carries over exactly to the mind. The distinction in language carries over exactly to the mind. The function of beliefs is to represent how things are, and they have what we might call the mind to world direction of fit. and the belief, like the statement, can be true or false. Whereas desires and intentions do not have the mind-to-world direction of fit. They have the world-to-mind direction of fit. The point of the desire or the intention is not to match a previously existing reality, but in the case of the intention, to get reality to change to match the content of the mind. They have the world-to-mind direction of fit. In the case of desire, the desire will be satisfied only if the world changes to match the content of the mind. So if I want to get rich or marry a Republican, then my desire will be satisfied only if the world changes such that the match comes about, such as I'm married to a Republican or I'm rich or whatever. Okay, I want you to see that distinction because that's going to be crucial in our analysis of how the mind works in relating to reality. Now, there's some speech acts and some mental states that don't seem to have a direction of fit in that way because they seem to take the fit for granted. So if I'm ashamed of something that I did, then I do have this state. Let's say I'm ashamed of my big nose. People can be proud of all things and ashamed of things. I can be proud of my big nose or ashamed of my big nose. A friend of mine was stopped by the police on campus. He's a professor of chemistry. He was out by the police at 2 a.m. and the policeman said, "Close your eyes and touch your nose." And he looked at this poor guy and he said, "With a nose as big as mine, how could I miss?" So the policeman just sent him home. He didn't have to close his eyes and touch his nose. Okay, people can be proud or ashamed, but it looks like, in a way, that belief and desire are supposed to fit with either the downhill or the uphill direction of fit. Shame just takes the fit for granted. If you're proud of your nose or ashamed of your nose, then it looks like you just presuppose that the proposition matches reality. And in those cases, I'll just say there's a presupposed fit. So you get the downhill direction of fit, the uphill direction of fit, and I'll just call it the PRP fit. You get three kinds of direction of fit. Now, we're being naive now. We're just going through and looking at the features of the mind. So far, we've found two crucial connections between the nature of the mind and the nature of language. This distinction between content and type carries over from language to mind. This distinction in direction of fit carries over from language to mind. Okay, questions about that? I want everybody, it's important to get all this stuff straight because it's going to be important for everything later on. Should we catch our breath and hand in your attendance sheet now? Would that be fun? Let's do that. What? Yeah. I want people to hand in their name right now so that the people who don't come in until 5 minutes before the hour ends will not be counted among the actual attendees. Okay, there's a third connection between mind and language which will enable us to explain intentionality. And that is, whenever you have a speech act with a direction of fit, yeah. Yes. If there are a whole lot of intentional states and speech acts where you just take the fit for granted. Suppose you say, "I apologize for stepping on your foot." Now, in that case, I'm not trying to claim that I stepped on your foot, nor am I trying to get your foot stepped on. It's not a claim that I stepped on your foot, nor is it the expression of a desire to step on your foot. It doesn't seem to have either of the standard fits. It seems to presuppose that I stepped on your foot. So PRP is just, I'm presupposing that there is a foot. So it seems like we ought to allow for those cases in speech acts. Now, similarly for the mind, if you take the emotions, if you take emotions like I'm ashamed that such and such, it looks like I am presupposing that such and such. If I'm ashamed of the size of my nose, or the fact that I was born with a silver spoon in my mouth, or whatever, people are proud and ashamed of all kinds of crazy things. It looks like you presuppose the fit. So it looks like, in addition to these two, where you've got those that are true or false, that's this fit, and those that are carried out, obeyed, or otherwise satisfied, that's this fit. It looks like in some cases you just presuppose that there's a fit, and if there is no fit, then the speech act or the intentional state isn't appropriate. It doesn't come off. So if you're ashamed of something that's not true, then it looks like there's something incoherent about your pride or shame, because the thing that you presuppose does not obtain. Similarly, if I apologize for something I thought I did, I apologize for stepping on your face, but I didn't step on your face. Somebody else stepped on your face. Then my apology is inoperative. We don't have a word for it, but it's somehow inappropriate or wrong for me to apologize. So in these cases, you take the fit for granted. Okay, now, yeah.
So you can be ashamed of your big nose, but then someone else comes along with a much bigger nose you don't have, so you're already ashamed. How does that fit?
Yeah, there's another intentional state here called envy. And you might be proud of your nose, but the guy next door to you has an even bigger nose. And so you are envious. I'll get to those cases. I can't say everything at once. I'm working up to those cases. And it's interesting how we have to give an account of the emotions. See, it's a kind of scandal that nobody has a decent theory of the emotions. And we ought, between now and Easter, we ought to at least get a good theory of the emotions. So let's work on that. We're going to address all those issues. Okay, now there's a third connection between language and mind. I think I erased the other two, but here they are. They're FP and SP. And then secondly, there's this, and this. And the third one is this. Whenever you have a speech act that has a direction of fit, the fit will either come off or not. The statement will be true or false. The order will be obeyed or disobeyed. The promise will be kept or broken. The request will be granted or not granted. All of those cases will be cases where the state of affairs that the propositional content represents will either come about or not come about. And I want to say we need a general term for that, and I call it conditions of satisfaction. What stands to the statements being true is what stands to the orders being obeyed, and that's what stands to the promise being kept. Okay, in each case, the speech act represents its conditions of satisfaction, and where satisfied, then the fit will actually come off, or if it's not satisfied, then it won't come off. Exactly that feature carries over to the mind. What stands to the beliefs being true is what stands to the desires being fulfilled, and that's what stands to the intentions being carried out. In each case, you can think of the intentional state as a representation of its conditions of satisfaction. Wherever you have a speech act with or an intentional state with a direction of fit, either downhill or uphill, then it looks like the speech act or the intentional state is a representation of its conditions of satisfaction. And I'm going to argue in some detail that intentionality is best understood in terms of conditions of satisfaction. That's how the mind relates us to reality. We have a set of ways of relating to reality whereby each mental representation is a representation of its conditions of satisfaction. Beliefs represent truth conditions. Desires represent fulfillment conditions. Intentions represent carrying out conditions, and so on. So that's our first theoretical claim, which we've got these so far. The key to understanding intentionality is conditions of satisfaction. However, we've got lots of problems with that. One problem is Well, what about these guys over here, the presupposed fit? How do you account for them if every intentional state with a direction of fit is a representation of its condition of satisfaction? What do you do with the cases that don't have a direction of fit? They presuppose a fit. And what do you do about these cases where you don't have a whole propositional content, where you're just in love with Sally or you hate Billy? How do you think of those as representations of their conditions of satisfaction? So we'll get to that in a minute. The tentative hypothesis that we have put forward is this. The key to understanding intentionality is conditions of satisfaction. Every intentional state with a whole propositional content and a downhill or uphill direction of fit is a representation of its conditions of satisfaction. But now we've still got to answer the question, what about those that don't have those direction of fit, and what about those that don't have a whole propositional content? I'm going to answer that in a minute, but first I have to introduce another notion. And that is, there is a systematic relation between these speech acts and these intentional states, and that is, whenever you perform a speech act, you express the corresponding intentional state. Whenever you make a statement, you express a belief. Whenever you give an order, you express a desire. Whenever you make a promise, you express an intention. And the proof of that is you can't conjoin the performance of the speech act with the denial of the corresponding intentional state. You can't say things like, the sun is shining, but I don't believe the sun is shining. I order you to leave the room, but I don't want you to leave the room. I promise to come and see you, but I don't intend to come and see you. I apologize for stepping on your face, but I'm not one damn bit sorry that I stepped on your face. Congratulations on winning the race, but I'm not at all glad that you won the race. My condolences that Sally refuses to marry you, but I'm not at all sorry that Sally refuses to marry you. All of those sound fishy for the same reasons. Notice, there's no logical inconsistency in supposing that the sun is shining, but I don't believe it. In supposing that I congratulate you, but I'm not glad. There's no logical inconsistency in any of those cases, yet there's something wrong with the speech act if you conjoin the performance of the speech act with the denial of the corresponding intentional state. Why? In each case, the intentional state is the sincerity condition on the performance of the speech act. Whenever you make a statement, the condition for sincerity is you should believe it. Whenever you give an order, the condition for sincerity is you want the person to obey the order. Whenever you make a promise, the condition for sincerity is that you intend to do it. Whenever you make an apology, the condition for sincerity is that you're sorry. Now notice I said there's no logical inconsistency in saying, I apologize for stepping on your face, but I'm not one damn bit sorry that I stepped on your face. So the two hypotheses are consistent, that I apologize and that I'm not sorry. But you can't conjoin the two because the performance of the speech act is already an expression of that intentional state. You are expressing the state, and it's paradoxical to express the state and deny, to perform the speech act and deny the presence of the expressed sincerity condition. Those states are sincerity conditions on those types of speech acts. It's interesting to see the conditions in which you might think of counterexamples. The sergeant might say to the men in a war, men, in conformity with my duty, I order you to charge up that hill. But frankly, I don't want you to do it. Now notice, he better say the second of those with a different tone of voice, because in the first one he's acting in his position as a sergeant. In the second, he's acting as your buddy, as your friend. So in those cases, you perform the speech act and deny the corresponding intentional state, because in effect you're dissociating one part of yourself from the performance of the intentional state. If the stewardess says, we will be landing in San Francisco airport on time, and she then adds, but frankly, I don't believe it. well, she won't keep her job very long, but if she does that, she will be dissociating her performance of the official speech act. She's announcing the plane will be on time, with what she actually thinks as a person. Does everybody see that? So the fourth connection is this. Every one of these is an intentional speech act, which is an expression of one of these. Every speech act with a propositional content and a direction of fit and a force, a type of speech act that it is, that's called an illocutionary force. Those are always an expression of a corresponding intentional state, which is the condition of sincerity, and the conditions of satisfaction of the intentional state and the condition of satisfaction of the speech act are identical. The statement will be true if and only if the belief is true. The order will be obeyed if and only if the desire is satisfied. Okay, now it looks like we're in pretty good shape. We've got a preliminary account of intentionality. And the intentionality says whenever you have an intentional state, it's got to have a content. If it has a whole propositional content, then it's a representation of its conditions of satisfaction. And in most cases, though not all, it will be one or the other of these, either the mind to world direction of fit or the world to mind direction of fit. But now we've got these problems. The problem is, well, what are you going to say about the emotions? What are you going to say about these cases where you presuppose a fit? And what are you going to say about the cases where you don't have a whole proposition, where you're just desperately in love with Sally, or you hate Jimmy, or you admire the Pope, or whatever. You just have an intentional state directed at a particular object. What should we say about those? Okay, I'm now going to answer that, but I need to introduce two other notions. The notions of the network and the background. But first, let's take questions. I want everybody up with this because everything else in the rest of the course is going to depend on your understanding of these notions. Yes?
See how a lie fits all four?
Yes, okay, let me explain what lying is. Lying is a remarkable capacity that human beings have, and animals can't do it. Maybe some animals with language can do it, but without a language you can't lie. Why? Because a lie is where you commit yourself to the truth of a proposition by making a statement, where you state that P, but you don't have the corresponding sincerity condition. A lie is a speech act where the sincerity condition is insincere, where it's not satisfied, and it's not satisfied because you are expressing a belief in a proposition that you don't believe in. You don't believe it to be true. So the lie commits you to truth, but the commitment to truth, if you know that that commitment is not satisfied, will be insincere. You will be making an insincere statement. Every statement is a commitment to truth, and a lie is a case where you make a commitment which you believe is unsatisfied. And that is a remarkable capacity that humans have. See, animals can deceive, and there's an advantage to the animal in being able to deceive potential enemies, but the animal cannot make a truth commitment. Now, many philosophers who write about this say, well, no, a lie is just a false statement. That's wrong. It isn't whether or not the statement is true or false, but what you believe. If you believe that the statement is false and you assert it, then it's a lie, even if it should turn out that the statement is true. There's a famous short story by Sartre. It's called Le Mur. Not my favorite philosopher, but anyway, he wrote some pretty good stories. And in Sartre's Le Mur, I'll call these guys Henri and Pierre. Henri is captured by the fascists. And they're going to torture Henri. And they say, where's Pierre? And Henri's lying. He says, Pierre is hiding out in the cemetery. Unknown to Henri, Pierre is in fact hiding out in the cemetery. So he lied, but unknown to him, the lie turned out to be true. So, what happens is they release Henri and they capture Pierre and execute him or whatever. Now, I'm sure this is supposed to have some deep existential meaning that got lost on me altogether. I was interested in the speech act part. And the speech act part is that Henri told a lie, but unknown to him, the lie turned out to be true. He intended to convey a false statement, and that's the definition of a lie. But in fact, the statement turned out to be true. So a lie is a case where you assert that P, this a sign is for the assertion that P, but you believe that not P. And the belief here is the sincerity condition. Okay, any other questions at this point? Because I'm introduced to, I don't know if I left myself enough time, but let me introduce these notions anyway, and we'll see how far we get. It turns out you can't just have an intentional state by itself. You only have intentional states in conjunction with other intentional states. So, for example, I now have an intentional state. I intend to go skiing. I intend to leave in a couple of hours. But now ask yourself, what other intentional states do I have to have in order to have that intentional state? And it turns out it's a big inventory of other intentional states. In order to intend to go skiing, I have to believe, with the form of intention I have to believe that there are ski areas in the direction in which I'm going. I have to believe that there are roads between here and there. I have to believe that I have a car that will take me on those roads. Furthermore, I have to have a desire, a lot of other desire to drive along those roads, to drive on Highway 80 to get through Sacramento and so on. I have to desire that the snow conditions be good and that the lifts be running. So in order to have the intention to go skiing in Squaw Valley, it turns out I have to have a rather big list of other intentional states. And just to have a name for those, I call that the network. Any intentional state only determines its conditions of satisfaction within a network of other intentional states. So if you, I don't know if these diagrams help, but if you think of this as my intention to go skiing, then these are all my other beliefs and desires and intentions. I intend to get gas for the car. I intend to drive along the freeway. I intend to be at the lifts when the lifts open tomorrow. So my intention to go skiing only determines its conditions of satisfaction within a network of other intentional states. And think of any of your intentional states. You believe that Barack Obama is president of the United States. Now ask yourself, what else do you have to believe in order to believe that? You got to believe a whole lot of stuff. You got to believe the United States is a republic. They have periodic elections. That among their elected leaders, the chief of the government is called the president, etc. And you can keep going with this list. So in general, we can say any intentional state only determines its conditions of satisfaction in relationship to a network of other intentional states. Now, this is going to be part of the key to solving the problem that we mentioned. It's true that you can have intentional states directed at a particular object, and you can have intentional states where you presuppose the fit. But if you take all of those cases, I'm going to argue that the emotions, for example, always are within a network of beliefs and desires. If you're desperately in love with Sally or Jimmy, you can only have that intentional state if you also have a set of beliefs and desires about Sally and Jimmy. Or, I'm not suggesting you should be in love with both of them, but one or the other. You have a set of intentional states. You have to believe that the beloved person has such and such features. You have to desire certain relations with the beloved person. So the cases that look like they're counterexamples, where you just are in love with Sally, or you're ashamed of your nose, those are cases where the intentional state is part of a complex network of intentional states, and they do have conditions of satisfaction with a direction of fit. Indeed, I'm going to say something later on. I'm not sure it's right, but we should work on it, and that is I'm going to suggest that the emotions are really agitated forms of desire, that the emotions always involve some kind of desire, but it's got to be a big deal, desire, if it's a real emotion. And this comes from the etymology of emotion, which has to do with movement. It comes from the Latin, e movere, it's the past participle of the Latin for move. And that's right because the emotions have to move us. So that would suggest what I think is the case, that the emotions in general are agitated forms of desire, typically caused by a belief. And with the belief as part of the content of the emotion. So if you're in love with Sally, well, the problem, as we all know, is that lovers have all sorts of different desires about Sally, and I won't go through all the possible desires, but you got to have some desire. If you're utterly indifferent to Sally, then I would say you're not in love. So you have to have some desires, and you got to have some beliefs. I mean, among other things, if you're in love with Sally, you got to believe that she exists. And I once had the nerve to present this view in a lecture, and a guy in the audience said, well, he'd actually been in love with a movie star who died in an airplane crash in 1937 before he was born. I forget her name, but anyway, what? Carol Landis, yes, very good. We have an expert, not only a great philosopher, but a great historian here. So this guy was a famous philosopher who had been in love with Carol Landis, even though she didn't exist. Well, okay, I'll give you Carol Landis, but she did at least exist at some point in history. I mean, it's hard to imagine being in love if you believe not only does she not exist, she never did exist or never could exist. So you have to have some beliefs about the beloved. You've got to believe that he or she has certain features and that he or she exists, or at least did exist at some point, or at least might come into existence. And that suggests that it's true that the superficial form of love is just where it's directed at an object would just be love and then N, just a referring expression. But if you situate it in the network, you'll find that you can't have that particular intentional state without its being situated in a whole network of other intentional states. And those aren't just associated, but they're part of the content. Part of the content of having a particular emotion. You love this object, or you hate this object. You're ashamed of this phenomenon, or you're proud of that phenomenon. That those involve complexes of beliefs and desires. So I think the conception so far is working out pretty well. Now I want to, I don't know how much time we have, but I want to introduce one other notion before we go, and that's this. I have said that every intentional state is with a direction of fit, is a representation of its conditions of satisfaction. And if you look at the network, then the states that don't appear to have a whole propositional content or don't appear to have a direction of fit, in fact, do if you take the whole complex, which is constitutive of being in love or hating somebody or having some other emotion. But now I want to make a crucial distinction between those intentional states that give us a direct, immediate, causal, conscious connection with the conditions of satisfaction and those that don't. And I want to say there's a distinction between cases that I will call presentations, where you're immediately presented with a condition of satisfaction versus representations. And the connection, the examples here I think are obvious. If I actually look at my hand, my intentional content is not just a representation of my hand. I actually see the damn thing, right? I mean, the hand is directly presented to me, and it seems to me misleading to describe that as just a representation, where if I close my eyes and form an image in my hand or think about the hand, that's a representation. Then I have one thing that represents something else. But when I actually see my hand in front of my face, I don't just represent my hand to myself. I'm in direct contact with a condition of satisfaction. Similarly, when I intentionally raise my arm going up is the condition of satisfaction of my intention to raise it. But the trying there, the intention, isn't just a representation, but it actually presents the arm going up. Now, what does that mean? Well, I think most of the things you read about intentionality make belief and desire look like they're the big deal, but they're not. They're very derivative. The basic forms of intentionality are the biologically basic ones. They are intentional action, perception, the basic emotions, hunger and thirst. They are basic biological ways that we have of relating to reality, and a high percentage of them, not all of them, are presentations rather than representations. Okay, we'll go on with this next Tuesday.